Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. It's a beautiful day uh, a, um, in November right now. It's warm in an ungodly way. And today I'm going to be reading a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. The section that I'm reading today is on art and revolution. So, there'll probably be it's the first part of a chapter, so I'll probably read the introduction to the chapter and this section as well. Let's see. So the chapter is titled On Art, Literature, and Philosophy. So I'm going to read the introduction, and I'm going to read the first section of this chapter. Trotsky, it needs hardly reminding, was a political animal par excellence, and Trotsky's writings, like his life, were devoted to politics. Yet, Trotsky was amongst the least narrow-minded of the Russian revolutionaries. Trotsky's intellectual curiosity was boundless. Trotsky's interest wide and varied. Trotsky's attitude to politics never so crude as to see in it the complete essence of human life and endeavor. Trotsky often regretted that the times he lived in were such as to make political problems, and thereby political activity, dominant in terms of urgency, so that other pursuits and interests had to be set aside. Footnote, quote, "It is clear that the 20th century is the most disturbed century within the memory of humanity. Any contemporary of ours who wants peace and comfort above all has chosen a bad time to be born," end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky's article titled On the New Germany. End footnote. Trotsky could not be said, of course, to have chosen a political, quote, career reluctantly, and in view of Trotsky's temperament, Trotsky would certainly not have been content to live out a tranquil, uneventful life. But Trotsky claimed, on the whole, honestly, one feels that which gave him greatest satisfaction was a good book and quiet study. Footnote. For instance, in the foreword to Trotsky's autobiography, he observed, quote, "A well-written book in which one can find new ideas, and a good pen with which to communicate one's own ideas to others, for me have always been and are today the most valuable and intimate products of culture. The desire for study has never left me, and many times in my life I felt that the revolution was interfering with my systematic work," end quote. Trotsky, My Life. And towards the end of the autobiography, Trotsky wrote, quote, "In prison with a book or a pen in my hand, I experienced the same sense of deep satisfaction that I did at the mass meetings of the revolution. I have felt the mechanics of power as an inescapable burden, rather than as a spiritual satisfaction," end quote. Trotsky. For most of Trotsky, end footnote. For most of Trotsky's life, Trotsky did not have time to read or study anything but political literature. However, Trotsky made an effort, and to a surprising extent, managed to keep abreast of developments outside politics, in literature in particular, but also in the sphere of art in general, and, though to a much lesser degree, in philosophy and science. Trotsky held strong opinions on these subjects, and Trotsky did not hesitate to express them in writing. It is true that Trotsky's writings on art, literature, and philosophy cannot be taken to constitute any major contribution to these fields, so that their importance in this respect should not be exaggerated. It is also true, as will become apparent, that Trotsky's approach to, quote, non-political subjects was almost always patently political, although Trotsky acknowledged that artistic creation was governed by artistic creation's own criteria and principles. Trotsky could never quite bring himself to judge artistic creation in independence entirely of other factors, without regard, that is, to artistic creation's social and political context, or for artistic creation's potential influence upon such a context. Moreover, Trotsky's writings on these subjects are not of a uniform standard. Some obviously betray a dilettantism and superficiality deriving from insufficient study and incomplete knowledge, and others are so clearly motivated by Trotsky's political interests as to make them only incidentally works of artistic or literary criticism. Nevertheless, many of these writings also show Trotsky to have had a natural sensibility for the artistic. Trotsky's political predispositions, whether personal or such as devoted for, or such as devolved from Marxism, were never so crude as to turn art and literature or scientific knowledge into sub-departments of politics. Trotsky's critical judgment was always conscious of the sensitivities and concerns of the artist, and his appreciation of the latter's work was more often than not marked by a satisfaction derived from the purely artistic qualities of the work. This aside, from the point of view of the present study, Trotsky's writings on artistic, literary, and philosophical or scientific subjects are important in that they constitute an integral part of his thought, and thus throw light on his political ideas, Trotsky's intellectual personality, and Trotsky's overall conception of human creativity. What follows, therefore, should be seen in conjunction with Trotsky's social and political thought in general. Okay, so that's the introduction of the chapter, and now here's the section that I'm reading for this video, titled Art and Revolution. In a previous chapter, we discussed Trotsky's attitude towards the relationship between art and politics. We there noted Trotsky's opposition, as it was expressed during the party debate of the early 1920s on art and literature, to the concept of, quote, proletarian art, or literature, or, quote, proletarian culture, and, quote, in general. Here, we shall not return to this issue, but turn rather to Trotsky's pronouncements on art during the 1930s, when Trotsky attempted to define once again both the principles of artistic creation and the place of art in society. As Trotsky had once denounced the attempt to prostitute the universality of art by transforming art into merely an instrument of class and party politics, so in the 1930s, Trotsky reflected bitterly on the extent to which this attempt had finally succeeded. In The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky noted that, quote, the life of Soviet art is a kind of martyrology, end quote. One after another, artists were being called upon to sacrifice themselves on the altar of Stalin's cultural decrees. Writers of real talent and conscience, quote, either commit suicide, or become silent, end quote. As a consequence, the epoch of Stalinism would, quote, go into the history of artistic creation preeminently as an epoch of mediocrities, laureates, and toadies, end quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. Elsewhere, commenting on the absurdities of the concept of, quote, socialist realism, a, quote, name, evidently, invented by some, functionary, end quote. Trotsky pronounced thus upon the state of Soviet art, quote, it is impossible to read Soviet verse and prose without physical disgust, mixed with horror, or to look at reproductions of paintings and sculpture in which functionaries armed with pens, brushes, and scissors, under the supervision of functionaries armed with Mausers, glorify the, quote, great and, quote, brilliant leaders who are actually devoid of the least spark of genius or greatness. The art of the Stalinist period will go down as the most concrete expression of the profound decline of the proletarian revolution. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. This article was originally written as a letter to Partisan Review and was published in English in the August 1938 issue of Partisan Review under the title Art and Politics. See also Trotsky's 1938 message to the founding conference of the Fourth International, where Trotsky repeated this, quote, disgust, end quote, with Soviet art, end footnote. In opposition to this degeneration of art in a society declaring itself to be socialist, Trotsky attempted to reaffirm those conditions which were essential for the development of art, and which Trotsky therefore considered to be both inviolable and in the true spirit of socialism. Spiritual creativeness, Trotsky declared, quote, demands freedom, end quote. Marx had once written that an artist necessarily regards his work not as a, quote, means, but as a, quote, end in itself, end quote. Quote, it is more than ever fitting to use this statement against those who would regiment intellectual activity in the direction of ends foreign to itself, and prescribe, in the guise of so-called reasons of state, the themes of art, ... In the realm of artistic creation, the imagination must escape from all constraints and must under no pretext allow imagination's self to be placed under bonds. To those who urge us ... to consent that art should submit to a discipline which we hold to be radically incompatible with art's nature, we give a flat refusal, and we repeat our deliberate intention of standing by the formula, complete freedom for art, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote, Manifesto Towards a Revolutionary Free Art. This, quote, manifesto was first published in the autumn 1938 issue of Partisan Review under the signatures of the French surrealist writer André Breton and the Mexican painter Diego Rivera. Breton later revealed, however, in his Le Clé de Champ, that it was drawn up during discussions with Trotsky in Mexico in 1938, and that it was Trotsky and Breton who in fact composed it. Quote, for tactical reasons, Trotsky requested that the signature of Diego Rivera be substituted for his own, end quote, André Breton. End footnote. Trotsky believed that, quote, art, like science, not only does not seek orders, but, by its very essence, cannot tolerate orders, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. However, see also Trotsky's 1933 letter published in the Bulletin Opposition Bulletin of July 1933, where Trotsky, while emphasizing the need for artistic liberty and tolerance, stipulated two conditions for party interference in an artist's work. When the latter is directed against the, quote, revolutionary tasks of the proletariat, end quote, and when, quote, generalization in the field of art passes directly into the field of politics, end quote. Trotsky, end footnote. Thus, quote, to command, end quote, art was to stifle and destroy art. This did not mean, however, that art was either politically neutral or politically uninvolved. It meant only that art could not be regulated by directives from above. As for its commitment to social and political causes, this was both unavoidable and desirable. Just as a political revolution sought to break down old institutions in order to create new forms of political life, so an artistic revolution sought to break out of old styles and manners of expression in order to create new forms of spiritual life. The two, quote, revolutions, however, were not unrelated, since both were dependent upon and contributed to a new human consciousness. Without a change in man's spiritual capacities, political freedom would remain unfulfilled. And without a free political climate, art could not flourish. Quote, it should be clear, ... that in defending freedom of thought, we have no intention of justifying political indifference, ... We believe that the supreme task of art in our epoch is to take part actively and consciously in the preparation of the revolution. But the artist cannot serve the struggle for freedom unless the artist subjectively assimilates its social content, unless the artist feels in his very nerves its meaning and drama and freely asks to give his own inner world incarnation in his art, end quote. Trotsky. This should not be read as implying that Trotsky held the crude view that artistic and political movements either necessarily coincided or paralleled each other in terms of their ideological content, or even that the artist was motivated by the same goals as the political revolutionary. At the most, Trotsky believed, one could speak of a kind of zeitgeist, which, having that zeitgeist's origins in particular social conditions affected the artist as the zeitgeist did the man of action. Themes directly voiced by a political movement could be echoed, though in a way characteristic of creative expression, in works of art. It was not surprising, therefore, that there should be a certain coincidence between the content of a political rebellion and that of an artistic rebellion. But this did not mean that only one particular form of artistic expression was either legitimate or necessary from the point of view of political goals. And it certainly did not mean that artistic expression need adopt the terminology or the language in general politics. Were it to do so, it would cease to be artistic and would become an adjunct of politics. At best a form of propaganda masquerading as art, but neither having any effect beyond the immediate political goal it was serving, and even here a dubious effect, nor contributing anything to the sphere of spiritual and cultural life. Quote, ... A truly revolutionary party is neither able, quote, ... A truly revolutionary party is neither able nor willing to take upon that revolutionary party's self the task of, quote, leading, and even less commanding art, either before or after the conquest of power. Such a pretension could only enter the head of a bureaucracy, ignorant and impudent, intoxicated with the totalitarian power, which has become the antithesis of the proletarian revolution, ... Artistic creation has its laws, even when it consciously serves a social movement, ... Art can become a strong ally of revolution only insofar as art remains faithful to art's self. Poets, painters, sculptors, and musicians will themselves find their own approach and methods, ... End quote. Trotsky. If there was no direct parallel between the interests of art and those of politics, there was, nevertheless, Trotsky thought, common ground for an alliance between art and socialism. To understand why this should be so, it was only necessary, in Trotsky's view, to look at the conditions of art under capitalism. Great art, Trotsky believed, was always timeless and classless. Great art transcended the limits imposed by the consciousness of that art's period and the taste and interest of that art's ruling patrons. Trotsky flourished in a bourgeois society. Art flourished in a bourgeois society so long as bourgeois society was itself a liberating force. Bourgeois society did not, of course, always welcome new artistic movements, but it could eventually accommodate itself to them, even offer these new artistic movements, quote, official recognition, insofar as the society itself was itself still vital enough to appreciate and pursue that widening of horizons, which also increased the scope of economic change and activity. In this sense, it could be said that art played a social role which benefited the bourgeoisie, but which was not directed by the bourgeoisie, nor even motivated by the interests of the bourgeoisie. Rather, it grew out of its natural tendency to break through limiting boundaries. According to Trotsky, the atrophy which set into bourgeois society, and which was itself a symptom of bourgeois society's inability to develop further, had a debilitating effect on art. Its economic vitality gone, its preparedness to experiment and change replaced by conservatism, its future threatened by social forces it could no longer control, bourgeois society began to fear anything which might disturb its fragile internal equilibrium. Art which did not conform to a class interest became immediately suspect. Thus bourgeois society, in bourgeois society's period of decline, could no longer offer, quote, the minimum conditions, end quote, for the development of tendencies in art which corresponded to new needs and aspirations. The artist, as a result, either became a servant of the bourgeoisie and his art class riddled, conformist, provincial, and ultimately without value, or he severed himself completely from society and took refuge in varieties of, quote, bohemianism, cubism, futurism, Dadaism, surrealism. These new tendencies, lacking a social base and committed, as it were, to a conception of freedom which was indistinguishable from anarchy, took on a, quote, more and more violent character, alternating between hope and despair, end quote. Little wonder then that one artistic school followed another without any reaching a full development. This was the source of the decadence of art which coincided in the capitals of Europe with the First World War and its political and economic aftermath. Thus, quote, art, which is the most complex part of culture, the most sensitive, and at the same time the least protected, suffers most from the decline and decay of bourgeois society, end quote. Trotsky. The point of all this for Trotsky was that the, quote, crisis in art could not be resolved by art in isolation from art's social environment. That way lay only further decadence, for it was a crisis of society as a whole, of all culture, from the economic base to the, quote, highest spheres of ideology, end quote. As such, it was a society which could be resolved only within the framework. As such, it was a crisis which could be resolved only within the framework of a society that liberated that society's self from the bourgeoisie and its obsolescent institutions, and which created social relations and institutions which were themselves liberating. If capitalism, at capitalism's height, was conducive to artistic development, how much truer would this be of socialism? That is, of a society which would transcend class distinctions altogether, and which would therefore openly encourage the universal aspirations of art, and, thereby, the liberating forces of art itself. This, Trotsky believed, was the connection between art and socialism. Quote, art will rot away inevitably, as Grecian art rotted beneath the ruins of a culture founded on slavery, unless present-day society is able to rebuild present-day society's self. The rebuilding of present-day society is essentially revolutionary in character. For these reasons, the function of art in our epoch is determined by art's relation to the revolution, end quote, Trotsky. Thus, paradox though it may be, only by returning to society could art become independent of society. For by, quote, returning, end quote, art contributed to the transformation of society and to the creation of that social framework which had no interest in interfering in the sphere of art, thus enabling art to follow art's own independent course in accordance with art's own, quote, laws, end quote. Quote, true art, which is not content to play variations on ready-made models, but rather insists on expressing the inner needs of man and of mankind in its time, true art is unable not to be revolutionary, not to aspire to a complete and radical reconstruction of society. This art must do. Were art only to deliver intellectual creation from the chains which bind it, and to allow all mankind to raise itself to those heights which only isolated geniuses have achieved in the past. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. The, quote, manifesto ended with the following words, quote, the independence of art for the revolution for the complete liberation of art, end quote. For Trotsky's earlier, largely similar formulation of the relationship between art and socialism, as well as for his general view of the social roots of art, see his Literatura y Revolucia, Literature and Revolution. End footnote. We may pass over in silence the question how valid was Trotsky's claim that the future of art was bound up with socialism, or, for that matter, with any particular social system, since the weaknesses and limits of this claim are only too obvious to anyone having even a minimal familiarity with the unpredictability of artistic development. Trotsky would have been on much surer ground had Trotsky merely put forward the proposition that art cannot escape the effects of art's political and social environment, but that this does not make it dependent upon or committed to one specific social system or another. Given, however, Trotsky's view of socialism as constituting the freest of societies, it is not altogether surprising that Trotsky should have prejudged the political and social conditions of the flowering of art. This did not in any case lead Trotsky into the pitfalls of those who would interpret the influence of environment upon art in a crude, mechanistic fashion. Trotsky was always careful to point out that the relationship between an individual work of art or the talent of an artist and social factors was never direct and seldom obvious. Quote, the opinion, Trotsky wrote in 1940, quote, that economics presumably determines directly and immediately the creativeness of a composer or even the verdict of a judge represents a hoary caricature of Marxism, end quote. Trotsky. And Trotsky was no less careful to warn against the absurdity that political commitment obligated an artist to select only certain subjects for treatment or confine himself to a particular form of artistic expression. About this, Trotsky had already commented in 1923, quote, it is not true that we regard only that art as new and revolutionary which speaks of the worker, and it is nonsense to say that we demand that the poets should describe inevitably a factory chimney or the uprising against capital, exclamation point, end quote. Trotsky, Literature and Revolution. Perhaps the real reason why Trotsky found it natural to ally, quote, great art with socialism had as much to do with Trotsky's conception of the nature of socialism, of the nature of art, as with his political commitment to socialism. Trotsky took it for granted that all artistic expression was a form of human rebellion, whether against a concrete material reality or against a spiritual reality and its tribulations. This is a theme to which Trotsky returned again and again in Trotsky's writings on art. Quote, generally speaking, art is an expression of man's need for a harmonious and complete life, ... That is why a protest against reality, either conscious or unconscious, active or passive, optimistic or pessimistic, always forms part of a really creative piece of work. Every new tendency in art has begun with rebellion, end quote. Trotsky. Not only may the external social environment oppress the artist, art itself may be a source of disharmony. Rebellion in art thus often takes the form of rebellion against art itself, or rather against the accepted conventional forms of artistic expression. Thus, a new artistic movement is first of all a rebellion within art. Quote, every new artistic or literary tendency, ... has begun with a, quote, scandal, breaking the old respected crockery, bruising many established authorities, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Letter to Dwight MacDonald, written on the 20th of January, 1938, and first published in Fourth International, May to April 1950, reprinted in Leon Trotsky on Literature and Art, edited by Paul N. Siegel. End footnote. Art, in fact, like all human endeavor that aimed at widening man's horizons, may be seen as a struggle against established convention. Quote, when an artistic tendency has exhausted that artistic tendency's creative resources, creative, quote, splinters separate from that artistic tendency, which are able to look at the world with new eyes. The more daring the pioneers show in their ideas and actions, the more bitterly the pioneers oppose themselves to the established authority, which rests on a conservative, quote, mass base. The more conventional souls, skeptics and snobs are inclined to see in the pioneers impotent eccentrics of, quote, anemic splinters, end quote. But in the last analysis, it is the conventional souls, skeptics and snobs who are wrong, and life passes them by, end quote. Trotsky. For Trotsky, this, quote, progress, end quote, in art was obviously analogous to the development of social thought and social and political movements. Footnote. In an earlier passage, Trotsky remarked that Christianity was originally a, quote, splinter of Judaism, and Marxism a, quote, splinter of the Hegelian left. Both were, quote, pioneers, both eventually acquired a mass base, and both, each in its own time, represented the progress of man in the process of self-liberation. End footnote. This being so, it seemed natural to Trotsky that art should become aligned with the social movement. In the 20th century, socialism, which represented the most complete rebellion against, quote, conventional reality, and which promised to enlarge the scope of human freedom. Lest the tendentious nature of Trotsky's conception of art in the 20th century mislead us as to Trotsky's intentions, it should be stressed again that Trotsky's view of, quote, socialist art had nothing in common with the theory of, quote, socialist realism, which was decreed under Stalin. Not only Trotsky's protestations against, quote, socialist realism attest to this. In the early 1920s, when in power, Trotsky fought against this tendency, and in the 1930s, the whole spirit of Trotsky's writings on art was opposed to it. Whatever the limitations deriving from his political preconceptions of Trotsky's view of art, Trotsky at least respected and defended the one principle of artistic expression, namely truth, which was incompatible with the policies of, quote, socialist realism. Quote, the struggle for revolutionary ideas in art must begin once again with the struggle for artistic truth, not in terms of any single school, but in terms of the immutable faith of the artist in his own inner self. The immutable faith of the artist in his own inner self. Without this, there is no art. Quote, you shall not lie, end quote. That is the formula of salvation, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. This is a letter Trotsky wrote at the end of 1938 to André Breton in some article, Art and Revolution, I believe is what the translation says. Trotsky declared, quote, truly spiritual creation is incompatible with lies, falsehood, and the spirit of conformity, end quote. Trotsky. End footnote. That is the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening.